There are moments in life when loss feels like a heavy stone pressing down on our soul. Perhaps it is the loss of a relationship, the collapse of a dream, a season of financial struggle, or the silent ache of opportunities that slipped away. In those moments, the human heart whispers questions. Will I ever rise again? Will God still be faithful to me? It is in these very places of brokenness that the promises of God shine the brightest. For the God of Scripture is not only a God who comforts, He is a God who restores, and not just to the same measure, but more than we can imagine. From the very first pages of Scripture, God reveals Himself as a restorer. When Adam and Eve fell, God's response was not permanent exile without hope, but the promise of redemption through the seed of the woman, Genesis 3 verse 15. When Israel wandered and faced judgment, the prophets consistently carried a word of restoration. New land, new covenant, new heart. Restoration is not an afterthought in God's heart, it is His very nature. What does this mean for us? It means loss is never the final word. Our lives may experience valleys, but valleys do not define the story, God's character does. If He is truly the restorer, then no matter what we have lost, His power to rebuild is always greater than the enemy's power to destroy. The Bible is filled with specific promises of restoration that go beyond mere replacement. In Joel 2 verse 25, God declares, I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten. Notice that He does not only promise new crops, but the years themselves, time that seemed wasted, seasons that felt destroyed. Job, a man who endured unimaginable loss, becomes a living testimony of this promise. At the end of his trial, Scripture records that the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. Job 42 verse 10. The story of Job is not just ancient history, it is a window into God's heart for His children today. When God restores, He multiplies. What the world or the enemy takes away, God has the power to return sevenfold, as Proverbs 6 verse 31 illustrates. His math of restoration is not one-to-one. It is abundance upon abundance. One of the most beautiful mysteries of God's promise is that restoration is not always immediate or material. Sometimes, before He rebuilds our circumstances, He renews our hearts. David, after his sin and collapse, cried out, Restore to me the joy of your salvation. Psalm 51 verse 12. The first thing God gave him back was not his throne, but his joy. Because inner restoration prepares us to steward outer blessings. Many times, God allows us to pass through seasons of waiting so that our hearts are shaped, our faith deepened, and our character refined. Then, when restoration arrives, it is not only sweeter but safer, for our hearts are anchored in Him, not in the gift. Perhaps the most powerful truth is this: when God restores, what He gives is always greater than what was lost. Sometimes greater in quantity, sometimes greater in quality, and sometimes greater in eternal significance. Joseph's story in Genesis reveals this clearly. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned, his life seemed to unravel. Yet when God restored him, Joseph not only regained freedom but was exalted to a position where he could save nations and reconcile his family. The loss became the pathway to a destiny beyond imagination. In the same way, your loss is not wasted. In God's hands, it becomes seed. Seed that, when planted in faith, produces a harvest far larger than what was taken. The tension many believers face is the gap between promise and fulfillment. How do we live when we know God restores but haven't yet seen it? The answer is found in trust. Isaiah 61 verse 7 declares, "Instead of your shame you will receive a double portion, and instead of disgrace you will rejoice in your inheritance." This is not a vague encouragement but a covenant promise. Holding on to it requires faith that what God says is truer than what we see. In the waiting, we can live with expectation, not despair. We can speak words of faith over our lives. My loss is not the end. My story is being rewritten. God will restore me beyond what I have lost. The posture of hope keeps our hearts aligned with God's timing and prepares us to receive when the season of restoration comes. If you are walking through a season of loss today, take heart. The God who raised Jesus from the dead has promised to restore. Resurrection is the ultimate picture of His power to turn defeat into victory, sorrow into joy, loss into overflowing gain. What feels broken beyond repair is not beyond His hand. The tears you have cried are not wasted. They are seeds of a harvest of joy. The time you feel you lost is not gone. In God's economy, He can redeem even the years. Your story is not over. God's promise still stands. He will restore more than you lost.